Bruce, you must have something really good too.
Of course I do. It's Bruce Danielson, and I guess I'm here to entertain you too.
Good afternoon and welcome to your Sioux Falls City Council informational meeting. It's Tuesday, January 22nd. We'll call this meeting to order. First item of business is City Council open discussion. Any open discussion? Seeing none, we will move to our presentation, Storm Drainage Division Overview. Welcome Andy Berg and Lance Weatherly. Thank you for being here.
Good afternoon, Council. I'm Andy Berg, the Environmental and Stormwater Manager for the City of Sioux Falls, and with me today is Lance Weatherly, the Principal Drainage Engineer. Thank you very much for allowing us to come today and kind of just give an overview of stormwater management in general. We did this probably 4 or 5 years ago and felt it was a good time to get back in front of you and kind of just explain what our group does and talk through some of the challenges that we face, and hopefully it'll be informational to you folks as we go through it, and we look forward to any discussion or questions we would have during the presentation or following it. Presentation today will focus mainly on the stormwater program structure, funding and responsibilities, standards for the development and engineering standards, and then also some of the common drainage and sump pump concerns that we get on a regular basis. Our team overall, I am the stormwater manager, and working with myself are from Lance from the engineering group, Tony Schneider leads our maintenance team, Rich Steffen leads our flood control team out of the streets department, and then I'm over our environmental stormwater erosion and sediment control inspectors. And then outside of Public Works, there are 2 groups that also help our team. That is the Parks that does our mowing and spraying in our drainage ways, and our floodplain administrator that helps assist with any floodplain issues related to FEMA. Funding for our program, primary source of funding for our program is drainage fee revenues, and then also there is a platting fee associated with drainage system cost recovery, the DSCR, and the regional detention charge, the RDC, are the 2 platting fees that help fund capital improvements in developing areas. Significant milestones for our program, I'll just touch base on these. Drainage fee was implemented in 1982. It's been around a long time. It's a great funding source. We were very fortunate that it was. Our predecessors had the foresight to implement this fee a long time ago. There are communities trying to bring something like that forward now and face several challenges. So it's been very beneficial. Our residents pay that fee. It helps fund our program. It's a great revenue source. It's a separate fund from general fund. DENR issued us a permit in 1999. It's a Municipal Separate Storm Sewer Systems, MS4 permit that guides how we control our water quality in town. 2003, following that permit issuance, we developed a master plan that identified regional BMPs throughout our city to serve both the water quality and water quantity detention need. 2005, we implemented our sump pump collection system requirement for all new development. 2014, our flood control levees were certified, which took out over 1,200 properties out of the floodplain, which is a very significant change to the system. In 2016, we introduced our construction team into our collections crew. They're able to go out and do a lot of the work that we were having to contract out before. And then in 2017, private BMP ordinances were adopted that allow us to go out and regulate the private BMPs that previously were not addressed. They were required to be installed, but were never really looked at after the installation to ensure they were functioning properly per our permit. I'm not going to read all these, but there's some interesting stats. When you have time, take a look at these. The stormwater program is very large. We like to say our treatment system, our stormwater treatment plant encompasses the whole city. All those blue areas on that map are properties that the city owns that are drainage parcels. They're ponds, they're channels, they're BMPs. All of that goes into treating our stormwater before it gets into the Big Sioux River and flows out of our city. I'm going to focus first on the maintenance opportunities and activities that our group does. We have a great construction crew, jetting crew, and televising crew that go around the city all year round, basically performing improvements, checking that our systems are functioning properly. Here's a couple pictures of the work that they do, replacing busted concrete, curb and gutter. Our stormwater inlet lids, you've probably seen many of them around town. They get beat up heavily with snow removal activities, with plows grinding against the faces of those, with salt getting into them. So it's a nonstop activity. During the winter, when we're not able to do as much outside work, they're pouring the lids, replacement lids, during the winter, stockpiling those so that we're able to go in and swap those out on a very quick basis if one gets crushed or damaged to the point where it's a danger to the public. The picture on the left, we're grouting in some riprap in areas where there's heavy flows. Grouting it can help protect it from getting undermined, and just it'll still provide that energy dissipation. We'll leave the rocks up, but kind of lock them in place a little bit better so they're not moving around. Here's a great picture of inlet rehabilitation program. Inlets, not only do they fail with the lids getting broken, but if you can develop a seepage point or a void between the pavement and the apron on the inlet, you can get a sinkhole will start forming, and then pavement will start falling in. As you can see on the left, we go out, we cut that asphalt out, we cut that curb out, rebuild the inlet, and as you can see, it looks really nice after our crews get done with it. This is the type of thing that Lance and I never want to see, and neither do any of you, I'm sure, but this is what happens when we get a significant rain event, a major storm event. I wanted to show this to you today because this is actually a location where in a storm just like this in the past, that water would be up against that orange pinkish house and in the garage. As you can see on the left side there, we went out there and graded in an overflow pathway so that water was able to get out of that intersection without getting any higher and actually getting to structures. Some areas are a challenge where grades are very flat, intersections are not able to drain fast enough, so we do what we can in those intersections to try and get that water out before it gets to private property. Some of the constant problems we fight are utility hits, punctures to our system. It's a challenge that the private industry will tell you is very difficult at times as well. Nobody can be perfect, but that's why we televise our lines to see if we've had something like this happen, we can address it with that private utility, make sure that we get that out of there, get the pipe replaced or repaired so that when debris and water is flowing down that pipe, it's not getting hung up and losing the capacity in that pipe system. On the right is a drainage channel out by Grinnell Avenue and 32nd Street. A few years ago, we had to go in there. It was just getting overgrown to the point where water was not able to properly flow through that and drain out in a timely manner. We went in there, reestablished that channel, and then we seed that back and stabilize it and improve the capacity in that channel. This is a great example of a much larger scale channel rehabilitation. This is the type of channel that we would bring into our capital improvements program. This is, we call it the Tomar channel. It runs between Tomar Avenue and 56th and Cliff. The picture on the left was the condition when we initially walked the site to try and identify what we could do to improve this channel. Natural channels are a wonderful thing, but when a tree dies or gets eroded and tips over and lays across a channel like this, when that water flows through there, it finds a new pathway, and a lot of times that pathway is up onto the private property and the side slopes, and then it starts to erode, and all of a sudden you'll have a 10-foot, 15-foot tall vertical drop in somebody's backyard. So we go in, and it does a lot of times require significant tree removal. So it's a challenge with homeowners with these projects because they're losing a lot of those trees in the backyard. But in order to properly get heavy equipment in there to grade out that channel, add some riprap and drop structures, a lot of times trees do need to come out of there. It also opens the canopy up so that we can get grasses growing in those areas again to help stabilize those soils. Couple items that are not directly related to drainage, but we do help fund these through the drainage fees, are street sweeping and mosquito control. The street sweeping, we fund the first sweeping of the year because it has such a significant impact on water quality and our drainage system. If we can get a lot of that sand and material off the streets from the winter, icing, de-icing, all those type of activities before it gets washed into our systems during the spring rain events. We have less sand and grit going into our channels and ponds, potentially less salt getting into the water to affect that water quality. So we fund a portion of the street sweeping program. And likewise with mosquito control, because you saw that map earlier with over 200 drainage properties around town which have water or saturated conditions, we contribute to the mosquito potential, mosquito growth in the community, so we fund a portion of their budget as well. Vegetation management, I know I've had some discussions with some of you in the past on this. This very much so is a eye of the beholder type thing. Some folks like to look out their back windows and see a native prairie. Others want to see a manicured bluegrass lawn. We, 7 or 8 years ago, implemented this program. On drainage properties, we do not mow the entire property. We mow the outside 12 feet as a buffer to the adjacent properties. The remainder is left in its natural state with weed control, with an aquatic safe chemical sprayed out on the weeds to manage any thistle growth, that type of thing. We've also done this with buffers along the bike trail system throughout town. It's those taller grasses, while they can get garbage in them, that's the idea sometimes. It provides a filter or a buffer before water can carry those pollutants or that debris into our waterways, into the river. Our flood risk reduction program, this is the levee system, the flood control system. Many of you have seen this, but this is just a kind of a reminder of the whole system as a whole that we manage in the drainage group. We have 28 miles of levee. That includes 2 dams. One up by 60th Street is our diversion dam that diverts floodwaters from upstream of town around the city and down the spillway. And then the Confluence Dam, which is back behind like where Johnny Carino's is, right where Skunk Creek joins the Big Sioux. Those two function in tandem. They're connected with the SCADA system, so when one needs to shut, the other shuts as well to actively control our floodwaters during an event. We have the spillway, the weir up by Minnesota Avenue on the north end of the airport. We have 1 pump station, which is located down by Minnehaha Country Club, and then there are 6 closure structures as well. One of the primary tasks that I deal with regularly is the 408 review process. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but the consultants in town are, because it is an extremely lengthy process. Anytime somebody is doing anything within 500 feet of our levee system, the Corps of Engineers require that they review those plans to ensure that the activities are not going to lead to any seepage issues or any increased risk to our levee system as a whole. There's a couple pictures. The one on the left is the Confluence Dam, and the one on the right is our diversion dam. And on the left is a winter activity that we frequently do, cleaning out the river channel system within the levees. That's a requirement of the Corps of Engineers. We try and take out as much as we can every winter. On the right is Dunham Park entrance. This is one of the closure structures that we have. In areas around town where we were not able to put the levee system, such as at Dunham Park's entrance, there's 3 railroad track points, and then there's 2 points on 60th Street North where we couldn't just raise the road and put a levee across it. These closure structures are there. We practice at the Dunham one because that one doesn't affect the railroad or significant traffic. This is them putting it in. We time it to make sure we know how long it takes to do the operations because you need to do it on short notice for the Skunk Creek flooding. It's a very efficient system. It's all palletized in our flood control building, ready to go at a moment's notice. I'm going to turn it over to Lance Weatherly now to talk about the neighborhood improvements and our engineering standards.
Good afternoon, Council. Lance Weatherly, Principal Drainage Engineer for the City of Sioux Falls. What I have before you is a picture of our flagship drainage project for 2018. 2018 was actually a good year. It was very wet, record for rainfall, but I think our system did very well with all the improvements the community's been making over the last few years and all the investment and support from the City Council. I think a lot of people are aware of this project. We worked with our Parks Department to come up with a solution to address essentially a 200-acre plus watershed in the existing neighborhood. A lot of times there isn't green space or places to be able to do a lot of improvements in a fully developed neighborhood. So working with our Parks Department, we came up with a concept to go underground. This is the second underground structure, large one the city has. I believe this facility has the capacity of somewhere between 5 to 6 million gallons, almost equivalent to 3 water towers worth. And the best part is if you weren't here in 2018 or 2019, you're going to drive by and you're going to see a new park with a new walkway, and you won't be none the wiser that all this great infrastructure is under there. That's our flagship project. We are going to be finishing that in 2019, and it was going to touch almost 22 blocks. So another neighborhood improvement projects we do, we go in and identify locations in existing neighborhoods where an overland flow path is not present. In major storms, the inlets and pipes are not sized to convey stormwater for 100-year events. And essentially we live and die by our overland flow paths. So if those are blocked or up high, what happens is the water in the street builds up and gets higher and higher, and unfortunately sometimes it can get into a structure. So the picture on the left was before. The dirt and the grass was probably 2 foot higher than the inlet, if not higher than that, before we started the project. In order to convey the 100-year event with the tight constraints between the homes, we did need to install some retaining walls. This is kind of typical. I believe this subdivision was developed around the early 60s. For whatever reason, an easement was not recorded on this, and in that, what happens when people can put structures, fences, things like that, if that easement's not recorded there. So we go in, work with the property owners. Sometimes we need to do some negotiating to secure an easement and do these improvements. This is, I think, a very good looking before and after. Most of our projects we do not involve any retaining walls, but this was a pretty dramatic one. I know the residents will certainly appreciate the next time there's a large storm event that isn't rolling into their front garage. Another major component of our drainage team works upon projects is non-point source program. And a non-point source is different than a point source. A point source is essentially the discharge coming out of a pipe. A non-point source is essentially scattered throughout. So an example of non-point source pollution could be someone haphazardly putting fertilizer all over their sidewalk. With the city's partnership with the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, The DNR gives the city some principal forgiveness on our low-interest SRF loans, and that is in a sense held in trust by DNR, and the city is able to capitalize and work on non-point source projects throughout the Skunk Creek and Big Sioux River watershed. The bulk of those projects are upstream of Sioux Falls, essentially between Sioux Falls and Baltic. Things that those programs do is work with producers, agriculture producers, to do easements for exclusionary grazing, essentially keeping cattle out of the river, to keep that fecal load down. Also, as you can see, the bank gets beaten down and eroded, and that promotes additional total suspended solids. Other programs are working with producers to provide alternative water sources away from the river, or sometimes working with them on monoslope barns and things like that. Engineering design standards, we refer to those a lot with things that may come across with development or other things that something does or does not meet engineering design standards. And kind of in summary, urban areas have two separate drainage systems, and essentially the minor drainage system is to protect from recurring damage at regular intervals. So what the image on the right is showing is in the dark blue in a minor storm inundation. Our current standards generally are in a minor storm event, which we call the 5-year return storm. Essentially 3 inches of rain over 24 hours is the water in developments or newly constructed to our current standards should not be above the curb. Generally, the inlets and storm sewers are sized to convey that minor event to prevent from regularly recurring damage at regular intervals. So the major storm is when we look at and refer to as the commonly referred to 100-year storm. It's a bad title. We should try to refer to more as the 1% chance storm, but that's not as catchy. What we do generally with major storm design standards, we're looking at structures for the elevations to having the lowest entry of those structures to be 2 foot above that. Our standards generally allow 18 inches a depth of rainwater in that curb during a major storm event. So a common question we get a lot from residents that don't like, or it ires them that there's water in the street, or commonly after a rain event it's referred to as street flooding. Well, from a drainage engineer's perspective, I call that street conveyance. We're conveying that stormwater in the street. We're using that street to help us as well. So those are, and in responding to residents a lot of times that are asking for more inlets or more bigger pipes, a lot of times that's downstream, we're not able to do that. It's not as simple as just adding more inlets and pipes, and that of course gets rolled into costs of providing those systems. We did recently bring updated standards to the City Council in late 2018 and provided some additional flexibility as well. As Andy alluded to earlier, that the stormwater treatment is throughout the city. What this slide is, what we commonly refer to as stormwater treatment as BMPs. The BMPs, they are required by the Clean Water Act, and the image on the left is essentially privately owned and maintained BMPs, and those are BMPs that our staff go back and look at and are now inspecting on a basis. I believe there's over 300 in the city, and we've gotten through about 100 of them with a plan to get through the remainder of those in probably the next 3 or so years. The image on the right is our regional stormwater BMP program. Those are our larger BMPs that are owned and constructed and operated by the city. Those regional BMPs are constructed with funds from that DSCR and RDC platting fee from development. A BMP stands for Best Managed Practice. That can refer to a lot of things, but that's the term used in stormwater world for stormwater treatment. A lot of times any sort of pond is referred to as a BMP, but BMP is specific to stormwater treatment to conform to our MS4 permit. Here's an example of a public BMP. This is a BMP out by Willow Run Golf Course. We started that construction in 2017. It was substantially complete in 2017. We still did some follow-up work in 2018. So if you're at 6 Mile Road and Arrowhead Parkway in the southeast corner, that's where this large facility is. So this will treat a lot of stormwater and detain and slow it down to our standards for a lot of development that's yet to occur near like the Copper Creek subdivision out in that area. We're also kind of out where the new middle school is going out on East 41st Street as well. So we're starting to be able to build these in advance of development. That wasn't the case so many years ago when there was a slowdown in construction from the recession, but we are constructing these in advance. We're building one right now as well near the intersection of Madison and Veterans Parkway in the northeast corner of that, in advance of essentially Canterbury Heights coming over the ridge to the east and developing further to the east. Here's an example of a private BMP, a lot smaller, but essentially it's the same concept where we have certain standards of a BMP, a certain size. It is privately owned and maintained, so you can't tell, but underneath that tall grass there's essentially a sand filter with some drain tiles. We call that a porous landscape detention style BMP, and essentially it'll filter out the pollutants. And just like any filter, like an air filter with a car, it'll have to get replaced at some point in time in the future, where they would need to go in there and rejuvenate that sand and maybe add new sand. Another very large and big focus of our drainage team is our sump pump collection system. It has been required since 2005. The image on the right shows almost the 104 miles of sump pump collection system mains we have in the city as of right now. Developers must install sump pump collection system to serve development. There are a few exceptions on very large lots, or if it's slab on grade homes, a sump pump collection system would not be required. The city does reimburse developers for the cost of materials to install the sump pump collection system. And as of right now, connection is not mandatory to the sump pump collection system. So that previous slide essentially was focusing on sump pump collection systems and new development. We also have a program with going in and doing retrofits in existing neighborhoods. So on our website, we do have a petition form to go in existing neighborhoods that were constructed prior to 2005. If there's a lot of sump pump discharge that's creating a nuisance, we essentially prioritize where we go with those funds. We go in there and we install those in the front with a directional drill in the boulevard. And if someone is pumping and create a nuisance, we will have them connected. They can either connect underground directly to it, or we stub up essentially a riser pipe that they can put their black hose into from the top to connect to that. The image on the right with the red X through it is actually from our sump pump collection system project from 2018. It shows you can kind of see the algae there, but if you've ever walking on a sidewalk that has algae on it from sump pump discharge, it's one of the slipperiest things you will encounter, and it can be very dangerous and hazardous. As we kind of alluded to, if a person's discharges created a nuisance, ordinance can require us to have them connect. But it's not as simple as just saying someone needs to connect. They actually have to have something there to connect to. A lot of times there might not be an inlet right there, or there might not be a drainage way they can go to. And with sump pump connection not being mandatory. A lot of times when a person is designing a home or putting together a home, the discharge for that pipe might be on the opposite side. So what can happen is, you know, at the time of construction, potentially what can be a $600 fix can potentially turn into a $3,000 to $4,000 ordeal. And we've used we are very discretionary before we would demand that onto a resident and want to create a very, very high standard to make sure it qualifies that to meet that over, because that is a very big out-of-pocket expense to a resident. Other common nuisances that get brought to our attention is a hose across the sidewalk. When that happens, we commonly contact that resident and let them know a flat hose is acceptable to be able to discharge. A lot of times we'll get questions about, is it illegal to pump in the street? It is not illegal to pump to the curb as long as they're not creating a nuisance. The street curb and gutter system, it does just drain to our storm drainage system. And then the image on the right, there is a discharge pipe that is cast into that concrete curb, and as there's kind of a half moon shaped out in that asphalt, that water shoots out and can create an algae slick in the street. Encroachments into drainage easements or drainage properties are something that are very common. With 200 plus drainage properties in the city, each one of those properties has a neighbor that at times they may not be aware there might be an easement, or they're not exactly sure where the boundary is, or in this instance up here, someone did not obtain a permit which our staff would check if there was an easement and would not allow landscaping to be permitted in it. A lot of these times these can be very contentious. Probably the least favorite part of my job is going to someone and telling them they need to invest funds to take their own fence down out of an easement and move it over 10 feet. Or in this instance, this was a raised outdoor kitchen that was 30 foot into the drainage easement, and you know it took a lot of discussion, but you know the property owner was willing and cooperative and did remove that encroachment in the drainage easement. Raised gardens are a common thing, fences, landscaping. Things like that. Drainage concerns, a lot of, as elected officials, you likely get contacted a lot with drainage concerns. And essentially they kind of boil down into two big buckets on how the drainage team responds to them. There's either public drainage concerns or private drainage concerns. In 2018, I believe we had over 700 individual specific contacts with drainage concerns from our residents, and in facilitating responses to those with our resources available, we have to identify which ones are public, which one warrant the city getting involved. That might be something to either to invest funds or look at programming an improvement, or if it's private drainage concern, that it is essentially our response generally is thank them for contacting us, encourage them to work with the offending party, and try to work out a solution with the offending party. Private drainage is essentially defined as drainage from a non-public source. So if it's drainage that is not coming from a public street right away or a public easement, essentially usually raindrops falling on someone's backyard or roof, that would be considered private drainage. So a drainage easement, like I said, when we get involved with public drainage issues, is drainage easement is dedicated to the public where there's public drainage flowing or being conveyed through private property. So it doesn't necessarily mean it's your neighbor's drainage coming through your lawn. It's that we have a specific drainage easement. And a lot of the private drainage issues just come down to being good neighbors with each other. If we get contacted with someone questioning about, hey, I want to do this, what do you think? a lot of times I'll encourage them to, I would encourage you to talk to this with your neighbor too, because a lot of times just communicating ahead of time helps that. Here's an instance, this is a private drainage issue, but someone went in their backyard and decided they wanted to put 3 to 4 foot of fill in just to flatten it out. It impacts their neighbor's drainage. Structures such as sheds can block the flow of water. In this picture, the shed and the fences, they can certainly have an impact on water. We don't necessarily restrict fences in outside of public easements. Sometimes in certain situations, we might make a recommendation to maybe keep it up 6 inches off the ground in certain situations like that. Here's a good photo where I would say this person isn't being a good neighbor when they take their downspout and put it right to the fence line of their neighbor. And wanted to just talk briefly about what we're doing, what our team's doing looking forward. Private BMP inspections, as I alluded to, we've gotten through about 100 of those and plan to work through the remainder of those in the next upcoming years. A lot of times we'll get contacted by residents after the fact saying, they don't feel their backyard is draining well, or they're not able to come to terms with their builder on something. And a common misnomer is, well, the city was out here and inspected it. Shouldn't this be correct? The city does building inspections with plumbing, mechanical, electrical, those sorts of things. But as far as individual grading on lots, that responsibility does go to the permit holder. Currently, we do some lot grading inspections in areas of critical locations, essentially like at the bottom of the block, or if there's a public drainage easement. But as far as every individual lot, currently we are not as we don't have the resources right now to do that. Also with erosion control inspections on individual lots, it's called our MIX program, minor impact site. Right now, those erosion sediment inspections are done in response to basically someone calling with a concern. Where we're planning to have a more concerted effort to just be more apparent and looking out for those more sort of issues. So when a builder's building a home and the lawn's all tore up and we get a good gully washer, all that sediment ends up in someone else's yard. When they're doing that, they should be having a silt fence or some other sort of measures to keep that sediment on their property. We're also planning to continue our outreach with easements and regarding minimum grade elevations on structures. We have been working with building services on going to the Home Builders Association and doing some essentially seminars. We have engaged a number of builders in town with some non-conforming things, and I would say they're taking it they're looking at it a lot more closer if we're putting a hold on a occupancy permit, if the home was built low and they need to take some measures to correct that. So there's been I think an improvement with the builders throughout Sioux Falls, but as with anything, we continue to improve our outreach. We are looking to complete basically a citywide updated drainage analysis over the next decade using state-of-the-art technology. We've done about a quarter of that in the last year and a half too. So we're looking to use that new updated technology to help us better invest the funds that City Council has bestowed on us, and then also really looking forward to asset management, kicking that off here in the near future to help us better maintain our system that we have. So I guess with that, again, I'd like to thank the council for your support on our storm drainage program, and Andy and I will certainly be here to answer any questions you may have. If I haven't bored you to death talking about drainage on a December when it's 15 degrees out.
I like it. The only thing we're missing are the Mark Cotter charts in this presentation. No, thank you very much. Appreciate it. We'll turn it over to council. Councilor Brecky, any questions?
Yeah, I was looking at the slide on the master plan, you tell me a little bit about that process, and does that tie in with you talked about the complete drainage analysis citywide in 10 years? Tell me a little bit about the process you're going through and how you're accomplishing that.
So the image on the right is is essentially our stormwater master plan that was adopted in 2003, and the blue locations are areas that are completed where we've constructed a regional BMP, and that's there. The yellow images are areas that are, the red ones are ones that we have in our capital improvements program to essentially construct in the next 5 years, and the yellow are 5 years plus. As far as identifying areas where we're going through and studying, what's one thing is driving it essentially is, known issues or known drainage issues. We're certainly focusing on those. Our 2019 to 2023 capital improvements program was $44 million. Of that, I believe 65% of it, or $28 million, is being focused on improvements in existing neighborhoods. So I would say it's the driver of our drainage program right now is doing improvements in existing neighborhoods. So we're using that to identify, looking at coordinating with our capital improvements program with major streets, things like that, and also looking at known issues is what's kind of driving us where to go. We will become, right now we're on the precipice of kind of putting together our plans for our 2020 to 2024 capital improvements program, and that's where we look at on an annual basis of the wish list of all the projects we want to do, and we start then coming back into prioritizing which one should we do this year, which should we do the following, or are there ones that we want to maybe bump up to a year to coordinate with another project, or is there another project that maybe it's not as such a higher priority, it can move back. So it's something we look at every year in conjunction with our capital improvements program. So long-winded answer. If
I could just follow up. No, that was a good answer. But in those areas of town, pre-drainage standards, is that kind of what we're talking about here? Trying to wrap your arms around those areas of town. I think I know what slide you're going back to.
So Terry 43rd.
Before there were drainage standards, and then there's sheds and whatnot, and are you going to try to take a comprehensive look from a citywide perspective, or just because you kind of get stuck with dealing with them piecemeal, and I've been involved in 2 of them, and I don't envy your job when you try to do it that way.
So Terry 43rd, we originally did a study, and that's what drove the project, and that's where we kind of looked at a comprehensive improvement for those 22 blocks. We're going to get everything done while we're there. We're going to get the drainage fixed. We're going to do any spot sanitary repairs. We're going to get the streets fixed, and we're going to provide them a brand new park. So those are things that we look at. But yes, those studies will essentially help us determine how to prioritize projects for capital improvements program.
And take that bigger area, that bigger picture look.
Yes.
Okay. Councilor Sale.
Yes, down around Augustana College area, there's several properties that I believe the city has bought up for storm drainage. Could you give me a little bit of more information on how that process works and what your plans are with those vacant lots?
Certainly. In our current CIP program, CIP 11026 is called Colville Area Basin Drainage Improvements, and that's a location where we've identified that the best feasible approach is to do some voluntary acquisitions of some property. So 2-3 years ago, we did some messaging out to that neighborhood and did some press releases and did a press release on, the city is looking to acquire property in that area. Right now, we're essentially looking to turn that into green space. I believe we've acquired over 13 properties in that area, kind of trying to make essentially a larger parcel that's something of enough size that we could maybe do with later. We haven't identified that yet, but we have at a minimum removed structures that would essentially have been chronically flooded in the past. The flip side was we would had to have dug a canal from Augustana to essentially the Big Sioux River, and it was the most cost-effective thing to do a voluntary property acquisitions. That's certainly that's ongoing. I just signed one here today that'll be routing. That'll be probably on consent agenda here later. But that's a program that's ongoing.
Okay, just one more question. The retention underneath the Edison football field, how many gallons does that hold that's currently underneath there?
The underground detention facility under Edison, I don't believe it is large as the Terry 43rd facility. The Terry 43rd facility, the pipes were 11.5-foot diameter, and the pipes under Edison were 8-foot diameter. But essentially, if you didn't know that it was there, you would anyone driving by would not know that. But it's been serving us well. We've went by and looked in a few rain events. You can see there's some manholes where you see a little water spurt up, and that's telling us that it's getting filled, and it's helping protect those properties further downstream.
Thank you.
Councilor Neitzer.
Thank you. I do have a handful of things, so I'll just ask the standard three and then defer. And I will say I was inside one of those pipes when it was still under construction. It was pretty cool. And I do appreciate what you do, because this is one of the toughest things we deal with as a council. My first thing is positive drainage away from a home. Is that, I think that might be in the building code. Does anybody inspect that with like any part of the building permitting to make sure that
the International Building Code states there should be 6 inches of fall within the first 10 foot of the building. That is upon our building inspectors when they're doing their inspection to essentially walk around that and kind of take a look and make sure that is happening. Now, 6 inches of fall 10 foot away from a building might help you a little bit, but in a major storm, there's a lot of other things going on that, you know, if the building is constructed 2 foot low, or someone snuck a walkout into a lot that shouldn't have been a walkout, that's not going to help you. But it certainly is going to benefit with positive drainage away. But yes, that's a component of the International Building Code.
Okay, we talk a lot about, you know, this property wasn't or was developed before there was drainage standards. And so sometimes like a home that's, you know, below the curb, things like that. Is there a date in which you can say that that as of this date, the city adopted a drainage standard? Is there a magic, you know, where you can say prior to 1985 there was none and after there was, or is it not quite that clean?
I believe the most recent, I guess, we just updated we've been updating our standards annually, but probably I would say in the 90s is mid to late 90s is probably when MGEs, minimum grade elevations, and those were looked at. I want to look that up, and I could follow up with you, but I believe probably mid to late 90s. What we do, and when we go into neighborhoods, older neighborhoods where they weren't built that, a lot of times the house might be 1 or 2 inches higher than the curb. You know, and when we're doing an improvement to bring it up to current standards, we might have to put bigger pipes and more inlets in the street comparatively to try to make sure that water surface is not touching that structure in the major storm event. So we're trying to, it might get over the sidewalk, but we're building enough capacity in the street to keep that water from essentially touching that structure. So that's a tool or a way we approach it in going and improving existing neighborhoods that were built prior to our current standards.
Okay, and last one until I defer. You talked about that the system is working as designed, for example, in the I think the 5-year, if the whole street is flooded but it's not overtopping the curb. Did I get that right?
Yeah, the image I have up in it, there is a little difference between what kind of street it is, between a residential and an arterial, because on arterials, we want to make sure emergency vehicles can get down. So we do have a few more standards on making sure that there's a clear path on the center of the street, but in essence, in essence, the minor event is essentially capped to not exceed the top of the curb.
So the question I was going to ask, going to the major storm, the 1%, if, as an example, we have something that's a 1% or greater storm, it's going to overtop the curb, now it's getting into yards. If our yards are flooded, but it hasn't actually reached our homes, and our homes haven't flooded, but our yards are, let's say, completely underwater, did the system work as designed? Is that a success?
In new developments, we would want to contain the 100-year storm within the right-of-way. So generally, that'd be right behind the sidewalk. So we would look at both of those in tandem is either the depth, but generally we would want to contain that major storm within the right-of-way.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Councilor Selberg.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks, Lance. Question on the slide that says maintenance, pipe repairs, channel maintenance. I think you talked, that's out at Grinnell. That is similar to what's been done out in my neighborhood. I kind of watched that whole process. It was kind of fascinating. How often are there a lot of areas like that? And it was interesting because it was kind of there's a better term for this, but I always call it like a wildlife refuge kind of area behind where you had the weeds and it was kind of nice, but now it's just cleared out. It's like you say, you've seeded it. Was that done because we've had drainage issues out in that area, or was it done, I think it was for that reason too, but did it tie in also with the 85th project, so it kind of served two purposes?
It served a number of purposes. The flat channels will sometimes give very rampant cattail growth, and that has at times can slow water down, as Andy had alluded to with this image. So as part of that, going back there, cleaning that out, one thing we did install what we call a low flow pipe. So essentially the base flow is routed around that channel to essentially try to dehydrate the cattails so they're not growing as fast. So that was to improve the conveyance capacity of that channel and decrease the maintenance frequency of us having to go out there and maintain that channel.
And did that pipe, and I saw the pipe obviously get laid down through there, did that go all the way out to 85th? Does it come, how far does it go?
It's between 82nd and 85th Street is where that pipe was installed. We're, I think, planning to do 2 of those projects here in 2019. So when we go look at doing drainage channel projects, we'll see, does it make sense to install a low flow pipe? Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. But in that instance, it made sense for us just because we've been out there 3-4 years ago, cleaned it out, and give it 2 years, boom, the cattails are right back. And, it's a significant expense for us to be out there every 2 to 3 years cleaning the thing out.
Yeah. And the process was about 6 months or something like that? I didn't track it day to day, but is that about normal?
With 2018 having record precip of 39 inches, it drug out a little longer than it should have on an average year, but they got the project done.
Yeah, he did. Interesting. Thank you.
Councilor Kiley.
Thank you. Lance, maybe you'd like to just address some of the situations that occur. And I guess in my 4.5 years, some of the situations that occur involving water, and some of our citizens do not involve water coming off of public property and then into their yards. It's usually a developer situation, or maybe a neighbor has constructed a shed just upstream or downstream and is causing that backflow upstream. But and it's always hard to talk to neighbors in a situation like this when they have water lapping up to their patios or what have you. and then to tell them, well, sorry, it's not a city situation, but can you elaborate on that and maybe provide the council some advice in situations that we encounter similar to that?
Certainly, you know, they are situations that we approach very cautiously and diligently when we talk to residents about private drainage issues, because drainage is a very personal thing. Raindrops are not selective; they fall on everyone's property, and I guess what I would, you know, you can always refer them to us, or we can come out and help discuss and help with that conversation with them. But in summary, you know, our team focuses on public drainage improvements, protecting structures, and loss of life are our primary focus. Private drainage issues where there's rain coming from backyards or fences or things like that, those are secondary. But you know, it is hard to explain to residents or attempt to explain to them that this is a private drainage issue, and the city really doesn't have a program to go about doing this. A lot of times this is, you know, in this situation, there's probably fences on every backyard for probably a couple blocks. And a lot of times we'll get asked, can we run a pipe up through there? And I think it would come back to, you know, us starting to maybe go back and relook at the drawing board of how we're doing subdivisions. Do we want to, you know, clear a corridor out between everyone's backyard that no one can use, and that's off limits, that could be used or, you know, publicly preserved? Or is it in situations which, you know, we have 180 plus thousand residents with 40,000 single family homes. Is the frequency that it happens, does it warrant doing that for everyone with the situation? So I don't know if I'm really answered your question very well, but you know, private drainage issues don't involve public drainage. We're a public entity. I'm paid by public funds, so that's what my first priority and focus is.
Sure. Thank you. I mean, it is a tough situation, and one that I can certainly sympathize with, having grown up in a home that had water issues, and in my first home, unfortunately, had water issues, and just happy that, knock on wood, that it hasn't happened in my current home, but it's something that you're always conscious of. And I'm just wondering, it kind of goes back to what Councilor Neitzer had questioned too, about just some of the inspections, grading inspections, you know, when developments are originally put in to ensure that they're adhering to the plans that have been established.
That's what I was going to jump in and mention too, is, as Lance said, it's a private issue, so we don't have an easement to even go in there and do anything. However, we try not to just say it's private and hang the phone up. You know, we offer to provide a copy of the grading plan. Sometimes if it's very contentious, we'll agree to meet the residents and or both parties out there, try and just facilitate a good discussion, say, you know, this is what these contours mean. It means it's supposed to be a swale through here. Your landscaping or your shed is blocking this swale that's shown on the development plans. You know, be a good neighbor, do what you can to resolve this so it doesn't go to a legal issue, because then it becomes a civil matter where it's state law governs that, because there is no public flow. So we try and facilitate as much as we can without, committing to anything, because once again, we don't have that ability.
All right. Thank you. And then the last thing, and it's probably something that's on Councilor Neitzer's list too, and that's the sump pump collection system. I can remember when we had a presentation back in 2014, I asked at that time, what can we do to get better participation with the homeowners actually hooking up to the collection systems that we're providing the materials. So we have a big investment in the sump pump because the city pays for the materials, and the developers have a big investment as well because they're installing them. But in many cases, they're not being hooked up. And I know that I've tried, especially with Andy a few years ago, going to some home builders association meetings and some things that we tried to get worked out so we'd have a greater participation. But I, as a city councilor, I'm not sure that I've seen that level of participation that I'd like to see. So any thoughts on that?
With any change, generally the direction we would recommend is at IRAB. That's where the city works with the members of the Home Builders Association, Development Community, the private utilities, is form a subcommittee and potentially explore it more. The elephant in the room is it worth to put $500 on every $700 single family home that's built to help prevent the nuisance issues that come up that might cost someone $4,000 or incur more street maintenance or curb costs? That's the elephant in the room. Groundwater fluctuates quite frequently. It can move 4 foot in a month. So it is difficult for us to predict this person should connect, this one should not. I think myself as the drainage engineer, I certainly think it's a tool that the city should explore further. Some other things we are potentially exploring are doing maybe a pilot reimbursement program for connections, similar to reimbursing someone for a high efficiency washer or something like that, potentially to explore that option to be more selective and not more carte blanche, just everyone has to connect. So those are some things that we've been talking about in Public Works, but it is a sticky widget to try to figure out do we have every 700 single family home connect for $600? Because what the home builders tell us is when they're going through the build sheet, there might be 100 items on there. And it's either do you get new countertops or do you pay $500 for a sump pump collection system connection? Well, we know the boss of the house is going to win out on that one every time. So that's kind of how it works.
Well, I can appreciate that. I mean, $500-600, that could also be the refrigerator for somebody who's first-time home owners too. However, in terms of insurance, it is relatively cheap insurance because you finish your lower level and it floods out. Chances are you won't have flood insurance. Your insurance company won't cover it. If you have taken out special insurance for it, I would wager you're probably going to have greater than a $500 deductible. So I think it's something that we need to do a better job. I think the home builders need to do a better job as well too, especially if we're going to continue to make this level of investment.
Any other questions before I circle back around? Councilor Neitzer, go ahead.
Yeah, I would repeat that, and I think it would be interesting to explore the targeted option as well. I'd like to hear more about that because that's, I've even thought about it myself, but with the finished yard, it's just expensive enough of the quotes that I've gotten that it's a tough decision whether to go forward with it, and I just keep wishing when it was built, it would have been done, but anyway.
It's a like I said, a sticky widget. Put $500 on someone's mortgage, it's $2 to $3 a month probably. But on the flip side, we're continually talking in Sioux Falls about housing accessibility and affordability. The purpose of IRAB itself is to rid the city of unnecessarily regulations for development, but it's a balance of, and I think it merits a deeper dive of a cost benefit or a cost risk analysis of, at what inflection point should the city require carte blanche connections. We do have a few neighboring communities that are requiring mandatory connections. So we've been talking with others as well as what should be, how should we address this? Because it's only getting worse as time goes on, as we put another 700, that delta just gets wider as 700 more homes get built every year. And I think we have like a 16% connect rate. So, we're putting 500 homes a year on the streets without a connection that, we are then either having to do, potentially do a winter discharge permit or other things like that. So it's a good debate to have, and I think Public Works is ready to do a deep dive here in early 2019.
And if I may, since we're still on that topic, and Councilor Neitzer brings up a good point. Obviously, the time to do it is when the home is constructed, because after it's constructed, you have landscaping in the way, you've got fencing in the way, you've got cable, telephone, you have a lot of things that are just going to increase the cost greatly. And I'm not suggesting that we would necessarily require everyone to connect. As I see it, there's really a couple of different options. I mean, as you mentioned, the targeted areas where we know that there are water issues, there could be the option of everybody's going to install, or we discontinue the program if we're only going to get a 16% participation, or we do a better job with education up front and maybe some incentives to make sure that people are connecting the way we'd like to and the way the program is intended.
A couple of other ideas we've thought about is maybe discontinuing the reimbursement aspect of it, but we would obviously vet that through IRAB, or maybe instead of constructing them in new development, just redirect all those funds to more retrofits where solutions pop up after the fact.
We built a new house about 5 years ago, and I don't know that it was even an option. I know the infrastructure is there, but we have the cord that hangs out the side of our house. So for us, I don't know that that was ever discussed, but I agree we can do a better job as we move forward with the program. I like your idea also of the retrofitting the older neighborhoods, because that's where you see some old, long-standing issues with the water. So, Councilor Neitzer, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, I won't belabor that anymore, but it's all very good discussion, and I have even more ideas on the subject. Another thing I was going to ask about, and I do want to make sure I do mention that you're absolutely right. It's the toughest ones, and you deal with it every day, is those private disputes, because so often somebody may not see it that way. They may say, well, the city permitted X, I've been in the house for 6 months, the city permitted it, and you have drainage, whatever, and it's already doing, and so it gets very sticky. And so that kind of leads into my question. Theoretically, if we were to give you more FTEs, do you think that if you had the FTEs and you could do it, do you think it would pay back or be worthwhile to have you going out to every new home that's permitted and everything, and at the end do an as-built survey, something like that, and make sure that the elevations, that the pins are right in all the different directions? And, would that be cost effective? And then I guess the other thing would be, let's say you find out that it's not, then what?
Right. As far as whether it would be cost effective, we haven't got to that point yet. We have had discussions exactly what you're talking about, possibly another FTE or more that would do those inspections. On the flip side, we have talked about other ways to ensure that things are constructed properly, requiring developers to do as-built surveys and submit those to us, so they've themselves assured that what they've done is accurate. A lot of times, though, what we run into is the developer may have graded it right, but the home builder filled in the ground between the two homes and cut off the overflow pathway. So there's a lot of different aspects that come to that. Possibly it's an as-built survey by the builder with the building permit. It has to be submitted before they'll get an occupancy permit. So we certainly are open to the idea of FTEs internally. I'm speaking just for Lance and I. We have not talked to Director Cotter about that, but we're open to that idea of doing additional inspection. We're trying to do that in-house now, as Lance mentioned, in critical areas adjacent to waterways, that type of thing. But we are open to that idea. We have, though, discussed the idea of as-built surveys from developers and builders, and think that is a really good way also to it protects them as well. The builder can say, I submitted this as-built, and I did it right, and the homeowner themselves brought in 3 loads of dirt and did something, so it helps not shed liability, but it helps the builders and the developers also if they have that as-built survey themselves. So I think that catches it earlier. As you said, if we're going out and inspecting, the foundation's probably already poured, and if it was poured 2 feet low, it's very difficult to rip out a concrete foundation after the fact. We have builders that have done other measures by basically raising the ground around and having an internal retaining wall to offset that. That's not ideal, but when we catch it a lot of times, unfortunately, it's a little late in that process. So an as-built survey, you know, the developer, the builder, they're not going to want to find that out on their own dime. So that, you know, it gives them more awareness.
I've had a few builders tell me that you'd really have to do it really at the very end, like the, you know, having like a, it doesn't really matter what the I mean it does, but you know, like if it, you know what the bare ground is just when they do just the general grading of the whole subdivision, because there's so much that can happen during construction. You really have to see it right at the certificate of occupancy to really know.
Correct. Yes.
So my last few, so you deal with surface water conveyance, obviously. Do you do anything of permitting, inspecting, enforcing with groundwater? And that would be water tables, springs, you know, the sun, everything underground, for example.
No, there is no regulation on the groundwater until it is pumped to the surface and discharged out onto the surface through a sump pump. There are some monitoring wells that the USGS has online where we do, our water team does look at those frequently as where the water table is, but there's no current regulation related to groundwater and the flow of that.
So if the groundwater, let's say, is generally in my neighborhood at 4 feet or something, it's a really high water table, and I want to do a full basement and I want to go down 10 feet, and I just want to pump all year long nonstop, I'm allowed to do that if I...
You are allowed to do that as long as you meet the building codes for drain tile around your foundations, that type of thing. Certainly, we wouldn't recommend it.
Sure.
Slab on grade is a great option in the drainage team's viewpoint.
Sure.
The basements that are put into high groundwater tables can be very problematic for multiple reasons, with sump pumps being one of them. But unfortunately, like Lance said, some folks will dig a regular 8-foot basement in dry conditions, build their home, and then the groundwater comes up, or they dug through a vein of gravel and there's a conduit for water to get to their foundation. So it's not always predictable, but yes, certainly we'd recommend, you know, the best option is to possibly have a geotech do some drilling, find out where the groundwater table is, and maybe you change your house layout accordingly.
And I ask that only because sometimes even neighbors will bring that up and say, there's a high water table over here, and they're planning on, without naming even where it was, that they're going to build underground parking, for example. And so their assertion is that development is going to pump a lot of water and it's going to cause them problems, and that you should do something about that or not allow it.
Sure.
You know,
we don't regulate that at this time, I guess. As I said, we'd recommend you don't do that, but if you do, our ordinances do govern what you do with that water once you pump it. It's got to be not creating a nuisance once it comes to the surface. So if there's systems that can take it away through a piping system, that's great.
And last thing, when people say, I think there's a spring under here, what do they mean, or what are they getting at? What relevance does that have to development?
I think the assertion is that the developer may have filled an area in that used to be a swale or a wetlands and put houses over that. That may be the assertion. When I usually hear somebody say they think there's a spring, that would be kind of what I referred to as a gravel, like a vein of gravel that used to have a flow through it that could be conveying water to your foundation.
A couple areas are a few examples where I come across springs is when a subdivision is in a location that's had a lot of major grading. So if they've cut a bluff down quite a bit, you know, that groundwater might not necessarily just drop parallel with what the new surface is. In this example right here, we did grading at that BMP, and there's springs that are coming out of the hills, as it will likely take time for maybe that groundwater level to somewhat adjust, but in locations on maybe like a street project or a subdivision where there's a lot of major grading that goes on, where a hill might get cut down 10, 15 foot, sometimes we will see springs that will pop up out of that when you're really changing the surface of that ground relative to the groundwater in a quick manner.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions? I have two for you that will be quick. On the vegetation management, it says the mowing buffer of 10 to 12 feet. My question is what if the homeowner mows it further than that? I mean, then they want to extend their yard. Is there an ordinance in place, or what's the, I guess, the reasoning behind 10 to 12 feet?
Well, the exact 12-foot measurement is set on our mowers are 6 feet wide, so it's 2 passes, one down, one back. That's the 12 feet. The buffer width in general, we felt was felt like the proper width for we control that type of thing. We do have many folks that mow into our property. We never grant them that permission. First of all, it is technically trespassing onto the city drainage property, and our concern is their safety. You know, we have erosion, washouts, different things, or even a pipe that's daylighting out there they may not see, and if they drive over that, they either damage their mower or they hurt themselves, more importantly. And so we never give anybody permission to do it. We do have a lot of folks that do anyway. We discourage it. We do not actively go out and pursue those folks, but we ask people not to do that. We actually, on the larger properties, we will contract with a rancher that will hay the property a couple times a year. So the larger ones, such as the one on the screen here, if there's enough area, that we will hay those properties through that rancher, and then he's responsible for the spraying of noxious weeds as well. So there's some savings for us and also a benefit to the rancher at the same time.
That makes sense. I just was curious because the other thing is some people enjoy do it, or they're out there, and so it's 2 swipes of their own mower, that if they can save you the time and money but then it would be requiring everyone to do that. And I'm not saying I advocate for that either. It's just
when I started, we had properties where the gentleman that did the mowing had been with us for 20 years, and he knew that he raised his deck at this house, put it back down at the next one, and we just said, that's ridiculous, you know, it's the city's property, we're just going to mow all the way through. If folks want to do additional on top of that, that's up to them, but we don't grant permission for anything like that.
Gotcha. Thank you. The last question I have is the looking forward. You had 5 bullets on that talking about complete drainage analysis citywide in 10 years utilizing state-of-the-art technology. I'm curious what kind of technologies you're referring to and what new fun ideas essentially that you could do, or what can make your jobs easier to get you to assess that drainage area. I don't know, maybe drones or something along those lines.
The technology we're referring to is LiDAR data, and about every 2 to 3 years, the city gets reflown. In 2012, we had LiDAR data, and that was 2-foot contour intervals. In 2017, it got flown again, and it was a 1-foot contour interval. So on a really flat street, when I'm trying to look at a computer, when someone is on the computer trying to figure out what's going on with there, you know, if there's a point, if it's only 2 foot between it can be hard to figure out. So now we have the 1-foot contour interval data. It's much better, a lot more. We probably, working with GIS, will be bringing back a request for a LiDAR update maybe in the next year or 2. So we'll look for your support on that, especially as fast as the Sioux Falls is growing. It's good to have updated aerial photography when a resident is calling on a newer subdivision, that you can actually look at it and it's not just a cornfield when you know there's a street and a house there. As far as we have new software that analyzes kind of 2-dimensionally, And so that really helps us ascertain better inundation information, exactly what's going on. So essentially, I would say where our bread and butter is going to be in our CIP number 11087, which is our regional drainage improvements and analysis. Bringing that forward when we do our next CIP and looking for the support in that. So that funding our studies and also funding our improvements out of that is essentially what I guess I would ask the council for the support on.
Great, thank you. Any other questions?
One thing to add to that is with our recent LiDAR acquisition data, as well as we obtained information of actual impervious for every parcel. So using that information to help us model it better and potentially in the future maybe look at updating how we bill drainage fees, how we update our standards as well. So those are the technology upgrades.
Great, thank you. Thank you for your presentation. Hang tight just for a few moments. We'll turn it over to public input. Is there anyone that would like to address the council on anything that was talked about during our presentations? Seeing none, we will adjourn this meeting. I will remind the council that we do have a joint Lincoln County, City of Sioux Falls joint meeting in Canton this evening at 7 p.m. sharp. And there is no meeting next week. You have the week off next week because it's Fifth Tuesday, so there will not be any informationals or city council meetings. Just a reminder for you all and the public. With that, we will adjourn.